أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا كل شيء خلقناه بقدر وما أمرنا إلا واحدة كلمح بالبصر ولقد أهلكنا أشياعكم فهل من مدكر وكل شيء فعلوه في الزبر وكل صغير وكبير مستطر إن المتقين في جنات ونهر في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن إن المتقين في جنات ونهر في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان رب المشرقين ورب المغربين فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان صدق الله العظيم.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm going to tell you a story today about an iconic figure, Emir Abdulqadir of Algeria, who both in his lifetime and afterwards has become to mean many things to many different people. He was such an outstanding figure that everybody wanted to adopt him. Where the Orthodox Muslims claimed him as their own, the freedom fighters, the secular Algerian nationalists, the Sufis. Gosh, this is quite an earring. Thank you very much, Yusuf. I'm going to trace his origins from his tribal beginnings to a universal arena, from an outer jihad against his country's invaders and the darkness and ignorance of his own people, to an inner jihad where his worldly losses led him to deep openings on a spiritual level and a fulfillment that more than compensated for all that had been taken away from him in the material realm. Emir Abdulqadir of Algeria was born 1807 or 8, near Mascara in the western part of what was then the Turkish-controlled Regency of Algiers. He was to become a legendary figure, the fearless warrior who united disparate tribes against the might of France, the religious ascetic whose aim was to build a Muslim kingdom where people were governed by justice, the humanitarian whose chivalrous treatment of his enemies put them to shame. In exile and suffering an unjust imprisonment, the emir was to show remarkable dignity and forgiveness to those who had wronged him. In later years, he earned international recognition by saving the lives of thousands of Christians in a massacre in Damascus, probably the only leader of jihad to have saved his former enemies because circumstances made it the correct action for that time. In the emir, we have a shining example of a man who followed the Mohammedan model in the fullest sense, and whose fervent belief in the prophetic tradition that all creation belonged to the family of God enabled him to see the universal picture beyond his biographical identity. while in no way denying the illustrious heritage that was his birthright. Abdulqadir was descended from the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Imam Hassan and the latter's great-grandson Moulay Idris, the founder of the Kingdom of Morocco. In his own words, my forebears are famous in books and in history for their knowledge, their piety, and their respect for God. The Emir's father, Sayyid Muhyiddin, was the revered Muqaddam of the Qadiriya Sufi Tariqa in Western Algeria, and the family claimed descent from Abdulqadir Jilani, the founder of the order. So from his early years, the Emir studied in the family Zawiya and was steeped in the Quran and the religious sciences. The Zawiya had a large library, and despite its rural surrounds, people came from all over North Africa to study. Abdulqadir was a Hafiz of Quran by 14. He later confided to his biographer, Charles Henry Churchill, that the extent of his youthful ambition was to be a great marabout, like his father, whom he loved and regarded with an enthusiasm amounting to adoration. Just to give you a little bit of a background, the Turks ruled Algeria and had done for 300 years. It was nominally a province of the Ottoman Empire, in that the Juma Khutbah was read in the name of the Sultan, but it was practically a sovereign state. It was administered by officials of Turkish origin, and the Turks were very much the top dogs. Even the Kuglulis, the sons of Turks married to indigenous Algerian women, were deemed inferior. Shaler, the best contemporary writer on pre-1830 Algeria, he was the American consul, and he gives us a record which shows, actually, with all the problems of Turkish rule, the cities like Algiers were beautiful, organized cities where people lived in fair levels of peace, harmony, and education, with even dustbins collected. This, of course, changed radically with the French invasion. But he also comments that the meanest Turk rejects with infinite disdain all equality of a native with him, and proposition which has been inculcated during a succession of ages, that the Turks are born to command and the natives of Algeria to obey, has long been received here as a political axiom. And I think from that you can understand a bit how the Arab Abdulqadir was associated and said of being an early Arab nationalist, and of getting out, and it has suited the political leaders of nearer times to see him as that. There were often revolts against unjust taxation, and some of these revolts took up Ahmadis persona, and the local Sufi orders, who were always under government suspicion because of their influence over the local population, which was great, participated sometimes in these uprisings. Sayyid Muhyiddin was a man of peace, but when he departed on Hajj in 1825, accompanied by the 17-year-old Abdulqadir, he aroused the suspicions of Bey Hassan, the Turkish governor of Iran, not Iran. Thousands of pilgrims joined their caravan train. The Bey wondered whether they were using the pilgrimage as a pretext for launching a revolt. The Sayyid and his son were held under house arrest for over a year in Oran and might have been executed had it not been for the intercession of the Bey's wife, who belonged to the Qadiriya. And there we see that with whatever problems there were between the Turks and their subjects, there was still a possibility of mutual understanding. And the Sufi order, the Qadiriya, acted as a bridge between these two otherwise not communicating parties. The young emir had now been exposed to the injustices of Turkish rule and the corruption of urban living, so far removed from the simple, pious Zawiya life of his early years. The journey for Hajj expanded his horizons further. In Egypt, he saw many different sects of Christians, as well as Jews and Muslims, whose behavior was different from those he had encountered in the Maghreb. He was reminded of the Quranic message. If he wanted a single community, he would have made one. He created different peoples and tribes, so they would have to learn to get to know one another and to compete in good works. A meeting with the Albanian-born Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, left a great impression on Abdulqadir. Here was a man dedicated to modernizing Egypt and bringing it up to European standards. He was using European expertise to do this and had created a modern conscription army. The Viceroy warned Mohideen that the British and the French wanted to divide up the Arab world, and after their early attempts in Egypt, were now looking towards Tangier. Algeria, positioned in the middle, would not be safe from their ambitions. Father and son, like the Prophet Musa before them, journeyed to Mount Sinai, where they stayed as the guests of the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery. They made this dangerous journey to seek out theological discussions with Christian monks, showing a surprising liberalism for their background and times. But it becomes less astonishing when the family history is examined and a link to the great Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi is discovered. The grandfather of Abdulqadir, Sidi Mustafa, had received the transmission of the Kirka Akbariya from Sayyid al-Mu'tadar al-Zabidi, an Indian exponent of the teachings of the medieval master. He had passed the Idhan on to Sayyid Mohideen. So from youth, Abdulqadir had been exposed to the teachings of the Sufi master, whose most celebrated lines are probably, "My heart has become capable of every form. It is a pasture for gazelles and a convent for Christian monks and a temple for idols and the pilgrim's Kaaba and the tablets of Torah and the book of the Quran. I follow the religion of love, whatever way love's camels take. That is my religion and my faith." After Hajj, they went to Damascus, where Abdulqadir visited the tomb of Ibn al-Arabi for the first time. There was such a strong link between him and Sheikh al-Akbar, and that was a link almost from his birth and from his heritage, as was his interest in all the Abrahamic faiths. It was not something that sitting in a French prison, he took a look at the Bible. It was something that was deeply born in him and brought up in him. Then they went on to Baghdad and the mausoleum of Sheikh Abdulqadir Jilani, where Mohideen's position as head of the Qadiriyya in Western Algeria was confirmed, as was the family's chain of descent from the order's founder. This brought huge prestige and power. The Sufi sheikhs were of immense importance, particularly in a country which was poor and had suffered much. And then there started to be strange stories about the young Abdulqadir. A venerable old man had appeared to Mohideen and asked him where the Sultan was. Mohideen replied there was only him and his young son who was tending to their horses. The old man declared that the rule of the Turks was coming to an end, and Abdulqadir would rule the Arab West. There were several variations on this theme and other stories of the father's visions of his son's future. Mohideen allowed such stories to circulate, so it seems that the Sayyid was preparing the way for a superstitious people to accept his gifted son as an alternative to Turkish rule. The French at this juncture were barely on the horizon. When later Abdulqadir was asked about such stories, he merely replied, My trust is in God alone. Father and son were strict followers of the Maliki Madhab and well-versed also in the works of classical Sufism. Yet the people around them were often of a lesser quality and easily influenced by supernatural phenomena. On the summer after their return from Hajj in 1827, everybody was talking about the incident of the fly whisk, when Dey Hussein of Algiers hit the French consul de Val with his fly swatter. The French government later used this as an excuse to invade Algeria. The argument was triggered off by the Dey raising the question of a debt of 24 million gold francs owed by the French government for grain purchased from the Jewish merchants Bushnak and Bakri, who also happened to be the Dey's bankers. The grain had been used to feed Napoleon's armies, and the current French ruler, Charles X, was disinterested in honouring the debt of a past regime and hadn't replied to the Dey's letter. The consul rudely told the Dey that the king did not answer letters from his inferiors. This was too much for the Dey, who called the consul an insolent infidel as he swatted him. France's Minister of War, the Duke of Clermont-Tonnerre, advised war to restore France's honour, gain postal ports for control of the Mediterranean, and loot the Dey's territory. It would also divert attention from an unpopular government. In 1830, Algiers fell to the French army, but a month later, King Charles was replaced by his cousin Louis-Philippe, who agreed to establish a constitutional monarchy with ministers reporting to Parliament. Uncertain rule in mainland France and a general ambivalence about the Algerian adventure added to the chaos of the initial conquest. It was this confusion that made the conquest of Algeria such a nasty, confused thing. Nobody knew who was in power, who was ordering that, were the French just going to loot a bit, were they going to stay, were they going to control the coastal towns of the interior, of the exterior, or were they going to come interior? The tribes of the interior had seen European invaders come and go through their coastal towns, and to begin with thought the French, like their predecessors, were unlikely to make much inroads into the heart of the country. What they couldn't endure was the power vacuum created by the destruction of the Turkish government with no substitute to replace it. Said Mohideen was asked by a confederation of tribes in Western Algeria to lead the resistance against the French. He tried to pass it on to the Sultan Abdulrahman of Morocco. It was a mess. The 15-year-old son of the Sultan was sacked, upset all the tribes and had to be thrown back. So again, the local tribes asked Said Mohideen, take over the jihad against the French. He pointed out that he was an old man and a man of peace. He would take the position but would abdicate immediately in favour of his 25-year-old son, Abdulqadir. This was accepted because of the Said's reputation and also because of Abdulqadir's military prowess. For 2 years he had fought besieging Iran. He just rode in and out regardless of whether a bullet hit him or not, and it never did. So the superstitious people always respected a man who did not fear death in any way and seemed to be under divine protection. In 1832, he was installed as leader of the jihad. He refused the title of sultan, stipulating that the Jummah Khutbah be read in the name of the Moroccan sultan. He just called himself Emir, and then finally Amir al-Mu'mineen. His proclamation read that he accepted this position with reluctance, only to be a vehicle for uniting the Muslims, for preventing strife and dissension among them, for ensuring the safety of the roads, for terminating activities which are contrary to the pure Sharia, for protecting the country from the enemy, and for establishing law and justice for the powerful and for the feeble alike. Know that my utmost goal is the unification of the Islamic community and the execution of the Islamic practices. In all this is my trust is in Allah. So he had moved from being a tribal being into an Islamic being. He had a vision. He had a vision of a country where the Sharia governed and where the various Muslims, none of the groups particularly got on well with each other, were going to come united together in this model kingdom of justice, and where Western expertise could be used, because he saw that. He had seen the possibilities in Egypt. He didn't want to go back into a medieval past. He was a man of his time, and he wanted to bring to his people all the benefits of what the West had, but without the downside of their life. And that was really his life's objective. He called out to Arabs, Turks, Kaluglis, Moors, Berbers to live as brothers, worshipping the true God, and let us all together have one armed hand against the enemy. For the next 15 years, he strove towards a united Muslim kingdom. He came to power under the banner of jihad, but his authority and brief control of 2/3 of Algeria resulted as much from two cleverly negotiated treaties with the French, whom he persuaded to recognize his authority over the tribes, supply him with arms, and help train his army, as from his military victories. His objective was the Muslim kingdom. He wanted to get rid of the French, sure, but he was perfectly prepared to use them, and he would far, far rather have negotiated in peace rather than kill people. But he was surrounded by a lot of tribes who wanted jihad and looting. So he had a very difficult position. He had to be the Muslim leader, but at the same time, he had no personal inclination for mass murder. He issued a fatwa to all the tribes who had settled under French rule, commanding them to migrate to Muslim lands. But he was not narrow-minded in any sense. He was ably helped by Jewish intermediaries in his negotiations with the French, was very, very close to leading Jewish merchant families, brought in Europeans to set up a munitions factory, and kept abreast of European politics, following the confusion back in Paris, which gave this false illusion that perhaps Algeria could be free. One of his closest caliphs, Buhamdi, was a Berber chieftain who had studied with him at the family Zawiya, and he did manage to get some of the Berber tribes, which was really a first because the Berbers and the Arabs very much kept to each other in different parts of the country. During all this time, he suffered treachery from many of the Arab tribes, was not accepted by rival Sufi orders to the Qadiriyya, like the Tijani, who refused to submit to his rule. He knew that the Arabs would only be loyal to a victorious commander, and he had to rule with an iron fist to keep them under his control. Once, after a defeat, his own soldiers raided his family's possessions, and he threatened to abandon the fight and go and live in Mecca. He'd had enough of them. He lived an ascetic life of constant fasting and night vigils, wearing the humblest dress and eating the simplest food. And his reputation for justice and fair treatment of prisoners spread abroad. All the people who came to fight him considered him to be a saintly being, which is quite ironic. The Marshal Bugeaud, whose scorched earth policy ultimately defeated the Algerian resistance, was to describe him as pale and resembles portraits one sees of Jesus Christ. His entire physiognomy is that of a monk. His clothes are dirty and worn. It's clear that he affects a rigorous simplicity. Once France had committed itself to a war of total conquest, he was forced to seek refuge in Morocco near the border with Algeria. The Sultan, who was afraid of his popularity, was persuaded by the French to chase him out. So he had to decide whether to retreat to the interior of Algeria or surrender to the French. He chose the latter option. In his own words, "God is our witness that we have fought as long and hard as we could, so long as there was hope of liberating our country. But most of the tribes have quit the struggle. My own brothers have submitted to la Mauricière. Now Muslims are killing Muslims. The Moroccan Sultan has imprisoned our brother-in-arms Buhamadi, massacred the Beni Amma, and sold their wives into slavery. The French kept their word after Beni Salem submitted. I would rather put my trust in those we have fought against than those who have betrayed us. We must accept the judgment of God, who has not given us victory, and who in his infinite wisdom now wants this land to belong to the Christians. Are we to oppose his will?" He saw no reason in more suffering, more starvation for his people, with no possibility of success. In 1847, he surrenders to the Duke of Aumale, King Louis Philippe's son, on the understanding that he, his family, and some companions are given safe passage to a Muslim land. The Duke promises, but the French government changed their minds. And for 5 years, he and his companions suffer a difficult imprisonment. Some of them fall sick, some die. The emir goes on, sustained by unbreakable faith and long hours of prayer. But he's also encouraged by his former prisoners who come to thank him, by the support of committees set up by the French and other European nationals to campaign for his freedom, including the first Bishop of Algiers, Bishop Dupac, who was a huge fan of his. They had come together on the exchange of prisoners, and the French commanding generals were furious about the cooperation between the emir and the bishop, who were having cozy theological discussions about the Bible and exchanging prisoners. And they wanted to believe, the French soldiers were told, you're going to be tortured, you're going to be killed. And actual fact, for the most part, they were fed, given clothes, and the general said, if our soldiers knew how he treated the prisoners, they wouldn't fight him so fiercely. This is a complete mess. But anyway, the bishop and he got on. The bishop even wrote a book about him, campaigned for his freedom, and he told the bishop when he was in exile, "All my life I should have been, and at least I wish to return, so before I die, a man of study and prayer. It seems to me, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, that henceforth I am as though dead to all the rest." Imprisonment gave him the time to write his first book, Letter to the French, repudiating the slander against Islam of a French monk in Algeria. It sought to prove through rationality the existence of God and the reality of prophethood. In his words, those who preach sheer blind imitation and avoid reason are ignorant, while those who confine themselves to reason alone, to the exclusion of the Sharia sciences, are arrogant. He had long felt that the sclerosis of Islamic culture had come from around the 10th century, when, due to the decline in ijtihad, the intellectual decline of the Muslim world had begun. I mean, he, like people in the 20th and 21st century, have said, how did we get in this mess? We had the Quran. What happened? He blamed also abusive rulers who had cared neither for their own spiritual well-being, let alone that of their people. He was open to technological innovations, and in exile enjoyed visiting the great exhibitions of Paris and London. But he felt that while the worldly and technological successes of the West had led to their supremacy, they had forgotten in their material quest to the divine. He hoped for material progress for the people of the Muslim world, but feared that they too would lose their way. In 1852, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon, then President of France and shortly to be crowned as Napoleon III, came himself to Amboise Castle, where the emir was imprisoned, to announce his release. An immediate rapport developed between the two men, and when the emir visited Paris, he was feted. The people came out to the streets, calling, "Abdulqadir, be our friend." It seemed that something in the French psyche needed the acknowledgement of he who had been their most prominent adversary. The French were overwhelmed by his charm and courtesy. They may have colonized Algeria, but he colonized French hearts. He would joke that many a major enjoyed his elevation to colonel and colonel to general due to fighting him. He treated women with huge ease and good manners. When one inquisitive French woman said, "Why did he have 3 wives?" he said, "Because he had not married a French woman. If he had married a French woman, he would have only had 1. And you can take that as, as you like." When he saw the Madeleine in Paris, he stood in awe at its beauty, commenting that once he had believed the French to be a nation of unbelievers, but the Madeleine could only have been built by believers. A period in Bursa in Turkey followed, where he wrote "Reminder to the Intelligent, Warning to the Indifferent." He sent the manuscript to the director of the Asiatic Society, hoping that Napoleon III would be one who would help reunite the world into a harmonious community. Not that that happened, but it was a nice thought. He believed in the unity of the human family, who should be united by universal values. He was now a man who fought with the pen rather than the sword. After Bursa came his final home in Damascus, where he was reunited with many Algerians in exile, including former brothers in arms. He also was with his unseen master, Ibn al-Arabi. He started teaching daily in the Umayyad Mosque, and from these talks came his Mawaqif, whose interpretations he considered were directly inspired by Ibn al-Arabi and were not published until 20 years after his death. He said, "The Sheikh Ibn al-Arabi is our treasure from whence we draw that which we write, drawing either from its spiritual form or from that which he himself writes in his works." Spiritual seekers are indebted to the Emir for preserving Ibn al-Arabi's Meccan revelations. He sent 2 trusted companions to Turkey to validate and correct some erroneous passages in it. This led to its first printing. He believed that the Quran was a source of perpetual renewal in Islam. New interpretations did not nullify past ones, but rather allowed for new inspiration, appropriate for the time and place. He advocated the reform of a static Muslim orthodoxy from within, if the Muslims were ever to challenge the excessive rationality of the West. He was once more propelled upon the international stage in 1860, when he was responsible for saving the lives of 10,000 or more Christians from the Muslim mob in Damascus. He took his private Algerian army to the streets and evacuated all the foreign embassies. When the mob asked why he, who had killed so many Christians, was preventing them from doing the same, he replied that he had fought the invaders of his country. They had no excuse. He was showered with honors from many nations, including the Legion d'Honneur from France. What an irony. I mean, this man in exile would sit with the generals who he had fought against, going over battle plans and having a nice chat. He helped one of the generals, General Doma, write a classic work on the Arab chase and the Arab horse. I don't think you can see the jihadists of today sitting down and having a few cozy conversations. Eventually, a grateful France allowed him to go to Mecca and Medina, where under the guidance of the Shazali Dakawi Sheikh, Mohammed al-Farsi, he had his khalwa. The emir was allowed the privilege of a retreat in a rocky cave named Hira, near Mecca, where tradition says the initial encounter between the Prophet Muhammad and the Archangel Gabriel took place. He was to return to Damascus, fully awakened. He continued to teach there until his last breath at midnight on Friday, the 25th of May, 1883. His state perhaps can be summed up in a letter written after his halwa to his friend Charles Einard, a Swiss Protestant who had campaigned for his release from the French prison and was later to become a close friend and confidant with whom he would exchange many questions related to the divinity of Jesus. And I think it sums up the station of the universal being that he had become. Small as I am, I possess a great zeal and tolerance to a high degree, which makes me have consideration for all men of whatever belief and whatever religion. I even go so far as to protect animals, and I do not seek to do evil to anyone, but on the contrary, desire to do good to them. His great ambition had been to be buried by the side of Ibn al-Arabi. When Algeria declared independence, they disinterred his bones, flew them to be buried again in Algiers. I doubt if he was very happy to be used as an excuse for a secular state. Many of his family had chosen to obscure the fact that his whole principles were Sufic, and to try and present him as this thoroughly orthodox Sunni Muslim without too much reflection on the inner. The French bishops thought that because he was such a splendid chap, they must convert him to Christianity. And so they would send priests. You know, there's this rather patronizing idea. My goodness, an Arab, he behaves properly. He's decent. He's better than us. What should we do? He must be a Christian. And once one particular priest was dispatched, and he smiled and he said, okay, let him come. I'll speak to him. We can have a nice conversation. Maybe I will convert him. And I mean, his sense of humor never left him. The British, after his imprisonment by the French, absolutely loved him. Here was the noble Arab who actually believed the word a son of Louis gave. I mean, this is Thackeray, who was very anti-French. When the French smoked some Arabs in a cave, he made sure the whole international press knew about it. And he showed, I mean, he wrote beautifully. He understood about Abdulqadir, that here was a man no less quick to slay in battle than in peace to save, of wisest men most brave, of bravest men most wise. He understood that this was an extraordinary being, a being who was what he was because of the Mohammadi light, who even in battle, his tasbih in his hand, who never benefited materially. He invested large monies in Damascus to support the Algerian community, which caused a lot of jealousy. It was never for himself. He took on the responsibility for those people who were exiled like him. He was a remarkable being. He forgave those who fought against him, and he acted always from the heart. And I don't think it's surprising that many, many people have written about him, all taking the stance they wanted. There was a Russian who saw him as an early communist. What to say? For me, he remains the ultimate Mohammadi model. Thank you.